This panel is a University Admissions Roundtable. When I gave my keynote the other night and when Kim gave hers, some of the context within which we were talking about the things that we talked about was on university campuses. And what does it mean when university admissions committees and whatnot take self-identification on its own as a basis for making claims to, not just to being Métis, but to being Indigenous in general. And some of the people that we have on the panel here are on the front line of a lot of these issues as they manifest themselves concretely. There's a slight jiggle in the order that we're doing here, and up first is going to be Danielle Soucy. And I had a list with all of your names and everything that you do and who you are, and I don't seem to have it now, which is interesting because I just had it a moment ago. No. I had a thing with all their names and stuff on it.
Don't worry about it.
Apologies, they will introduce themselves. So up first is Danielle Soucy. Danielle is the Director of Aboriginal Health Services at McMaster University. Oh, and they're right here. Next one will be longer. Sorry, Danielle.
That's all right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I want to thank Chris and everyone for inviting me here today to talk briefly about some of the work we're doing at McMaster in terms of admissions for our Indigenous learners. I'm originally from Bactouche. I am a French-Irish person working in the field, and I've been at McMaster about 7 years now. What I'm going to talk to you about briefly is some of the concerns that have been emerging from Daniel's decision in terms of admissions when you have competition for seats, for funding and issues like that. And what I'm going to do is show you a facilitated admissions policy that we're working on at our institution that's been done and vetted through our community task force and our Indigenous Education Council at McMaster. I'm happy one of my colleagues from McMaster is with us today. So some of the main things that really come out when we're talking about admissions is what does this mean for students who are in the program trying to get into the program, and it's really about who qualifies as First Nations, Inuit, Métis, status, non-status, those types of issues. What we experience in Ontario at times is rather problematic because there are some organizations that are issuing cards for funds. And the organizations, we're not sure of their legitimacy, so this causes great concern across the faculties about, are these really Indigenous learners trying to enter into these programs? Or often, not often, in some cases, there are learners who see it as an opportunity to get into highly competitive programs. They're not coming into it in a very honorable way. Some of the barriers we know for our learners are coming from different demographics. So your average med students in Ontario is white, 2 parents, both with graduate degrees, $160K a year income. Their whole life has been spent to be geared to becoming a doctor and making their application strong. And we know for Indigenous learners that this is a very different reality, often mature learners, single-parent households. They're responsible for their families. They have their own families. One of the concerns I have, and I think some of the committee has talked about, is what happens when that demographic shifts where you have sort of the standard non-Indigenous applicant versus Indigenous applicant, but now you have this new cohort of students coming forward with this identification of Métis, but it's that 8th generation back, and they're not experiencing the same barriers. Does that then, because they're often have the higher GPA and the ability to have these great CVs, are they going to change the look of what the candidate is to the point that the admissions committee will no longer see the need to have facilitated admissions because they're going to look and say, no, they're on par. There's no more equity issue. So that's one concern. Another concern that comes up is when you have learners coming in who are checkbox learners. So there's the big discussion is everyone has the right to come to school and be who they are and not have to wear that badge of identity as they go through. But then what can happen in the feedback from students is this degree of lateral violence that can occur. And with this lateral violence, sometimes these learners come in and they're perceived as what we call like the Indigenous oracle, so that they're presumed to have all this information and then become the expert within the institution among their peers, and are not necessarily coming with the information to take on that role, not that they generally should. So these are sort of the really sort of negative connotations of what could happen. What we've done with this working group is try to think about more, instead of exclusion, which is where sort of these concerns come from, to inclusion, to make sure we can account for all the different shape and mix of learners who come in. So what we've done is we have a 4-part application process that we're now trying to move up through Senate, and we're hoping, I'm hoping today that you guys will help shred and really critique the bugger out of it, so that we get it to a good place. So part 1 of the letter of consideration is a standard, why do you want to be a doctor? Why do you want to be in health sciences? And the question that we came up with as a group is, what does Aboriginal Indigenous identity mean to you? So this helps set the tone of what their identity means and what they're bringing to this process and to their education, and then in return to their communities. The second part, and this is really where we're trying to think of every possible scenario and construct to think of what is a whole applicant, and what is this idea of, because it's about validating, and no one really wants, this is sort of really ugly work to look at, like who is, who isn't, degrees of indigeneity, but these are the different sort of scenarios that were proposed, that this will help give a full picture. So we're no longer looking at a candidate just as having a particular card, but as an individual, as an Indigenous individual coming into the field. So I'm hoping at some point, if you can take a look and really start really critiquing and helping us in our work, we would be grateful about what's missing. What are the problems here? What are we isolating or removing people that are not being accounted for? The next part is a letter of recommendation. And again, who writes the letters? These are the questions I get in my role. Working in student services is, who writes my letter? What should it say? So who are the people who can write letters? So, these are examples of all the various folks that an applicant can go to for a letter of recommendation saying, yes, we know this person, they're known to us. And this could be someone, whether they they could be a child that grew up in an urban environment and mom and dad are not really connected, but they feel it, they're connected in their own way and want to learn more. So these are different ways to make sure that they're accounted for. And also with the option of an oral recommendation, because sometimes they want their cookum to come and do it. So that's a phone-in option for the applicant to say that, yeah, we know this person and they're fabulous and this is the way they can come in. The last part of it is also to make sure they succeed, and by doing that, they're going to meet with either myself or our faculty advisor a couple of times a year, so they know that they're supported, that no matter where this learner's coming from, they have resources. We can help them with scholarships, connect them with community. We don't have a residency requirement in Ontario, so applicants come from across the country for many of our health science programs. So this is sort of the where we're at now, and we're hoping to really take this to the Senate for the next intake so that we can deal with these questions of what is legitimate cards, because I'm not able to make that determination. A community of Indigenous folks are better able to look at it, but it's still this process of how do you validate and question someone's identity. I'll just go back to the B and leave that up there as I wrap up, and just hopefully, again, ask if you can, during the course of this session, take a look at this and really start saying, this is really problematic, or, we don't want human rights lawsuits. We don't want to discourage learners from applying. We actually want to make sure we can bring everyone that wants to come into medicine or nursing or OT and PT into the field. So that'll be it, I think. Is that 5? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
So I should have said this earlier. So the way that this operates is more of a roundtable. Everyone will give up and sort of give 5 or 6 minutes, and then they'll have a discussion amongst themselves, and then we can open it up for questions afterwards. Second person up is Lisa Collins, who's currently the Vice Provost and University Registrar at the University of Alberta. She's responsible for, there's a whole list of things here, but mainly most things kind of related to registration and registration-like services. And with that, I'll invite Lisa.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. As Chris mentioned, I'm responsible for a whole host of administrative functions in student administration at the University of Alberta. We recruit, admit, and register students, we assess their fees, administer scholarships and bursaries, schedule classes and exams, and we organize graduation. Among those functions, university admissions is, without exception, always the hot topic wherever I go, and so I'm pleased to be here to say a few words about it today. This isn't surprising given what university admissions processes are designed to do. Admissions functions like a gate through which students seeking entrance to our community in our universities must pass. Admissions by its nature is selective in that not everyone who might wish to pass through that gate is deemed eligible to do so. Similarly to these symposium discussions, which I've been watching via live stream over the last couple of days, we turn our attention to who exactly should be included, who should be excluded, and who among us gets to make that decision, who gets to decide. Making an admission decision, and we make about 30,000 of them, 32,000 of them every year at the University of Alberta, in accordance with some set of approved rules, that's the easy part. That's just processing volume. Figuring out whether universities are collectively making the right decisions and whether we're shaping our academic communities in the right way in accordance with our values, that's the hard part. When universities get it right, we admit students who are prepared to succeed in the programs that they've chosen, and we support them along the way, and then they are able to complete their programs as planned, and they see student success. When we see, as we often do in programs like medicine, where we see demand exceeding our capacity to admit those students, a well-designed admissions process will select those students who are competitive amongst the applicant pool. So we pick the best qualified ones. And when we get it right, the university admissions process is a tool in building a given intake of students in a given year. This goes on to build the student body. That goes on to build our graduates who become our alumni base. And in this way, we shape our university communities and we shape important sectors of society. So by selecting certain students and refusing others, over 32,000 times a year, in my case, we're selecting, whether we realize it or not, for certain characteristics in the student body. And this is why admissions deserves this kind of panel discussion and why it deserves the amount of scrutiny that it receives. We need to be sure that our approach to admissions instantiates the values of a university as an academic community and reflects our role as leader in society. You'll note that I said a lot of times when we get it right or when a university gets it right. It turns out it's really hard to get it right, and historically universities haven't always gotten it right. In its most traditional form, a basic admission process will not build the kind of student body and the kind of community that we might seek that reflects our values. Admissions processes are usually, when you hear people talk about them, you hear words like fairness and consistency. Well, indeed, fairness and consistency are important, and they're important goals, but what about equity? And how do we build true equity? It's both critical in an admissions process, and it's also much harder to achieve. Equity in our processes mean looking at carefully on who we let through that admissions gate and who is left standing on the other side. Just as importantly, we have to think about who didn't even approach the gate because they had reason to believe that they wouldn't be successful in getting through, or those who haven't applied because they worry that even though if they'll be admitted, they won't be accepted or they won't be welcome among the group on the other side. They won't feel as though they belong. At the University of Alberta, we're really proud to say that we've got over 1,000 self-identified Indigenous students. That 1,000 number was elusive to us for quite a long time, and we're really proud that we've achieved it. But this is only about 3% of our undergraduate body. We're making important gains year over year, and this is the result of many work in our university community and many, many partners in Indigenous communities. But it isn't, and this isn't just active recruitment of qualified students to get the numbers up. Growing Indigenous enrollment, as we seek to do, means careful stewardship of our relationships with Indigenous communities. It means developing and improving pathways into the university that meet more of our students exactly where they are at. It means providing academic and other supports for our students along the way, and ensuring that Indigenous peoples and culture and ceremonies are highly visible on our campuses and in our curricula. Just last year at our university, we saw an increase of nearly 10% in self-identified Aboriginal enrollment in our undergraduate population. So this is the result of a combination of increased willingness to self-identify, we're making some inroads there, as well as successful recruitment efforts. Still, we know we must do much more. We have had a goal for many years of enrolling Indigenous students in at least the proportion they represent in Alberta's population. We're really only approaching the halfway point. And because this is the fastest growing sector of our population, the target keeps moving. You know, the moment we take a step forward, we're a little bit further away from our target. At the University of Alberta, we've had some really lively and challenging discussions over the last few years about our Aboriginal admissions policy. We offer a number of options for our Indigenous students. We offer specific consideration in the admissions process to students who can provide proof, so this is the tricky part, of First Nations, Métis, or Inuit status, or proof of Aboriginal ancestry. How people go about getting that proof, whether or not, as my colleague said, whether or not the applicant is approaching studies in this category in an honorable way, that's where it gets very tricky for us. We set aside a number of seats in a number of programs that are beyond the target enrollment for those programs. Students in this category are also eligible for specific scholarships or other kinds of student financial supports. Of course, we will continue to promote self-identification, but in many of these programs, self-identification is not enough. We have been requiring proof where we've got specific seats or scholarships set aside for Indigenous students. The challenge then becomes who should hold these spaces and what forms of proof we should require. We began our work on revising our policy on Aboriginal admissions more than 5 years ago. Before I even joined the University of Alberta, this was well underway, and our moderator, Chris Andersen, has been involved in this conversation for a long time. We're now partway through the approval process on a particular set of those policy changes. The liveliest of the discussions is focused in two areas. First, our policy previously focused quite narrowly on ability to prove Indigenous ancestry. We use the word Aboriginal ancestry in our policy. There have been calls from within our community to change that and instead focus on identity and to think about what that might mean in both symbolic and practical terms as a policy change. That change sparked another conversation, quite controversial, sometimes generating more heat than light, about connection to community as a facet of identity, and whether a student wishing to hold a seat designated for Indigenous people should also be required to demonstrate active connection of some kind, how they would go about doing that, and what about the people who had become disconnected from community by no fault of their own. And so this has been a very active, as I say, and lively discussion over the last couple of years. Throughout, it has been very important for us to think about what it is we're trying to achieve, and that's the advice that I give to my counterparts that are also working on policy change or policy development on Indigenous admissions at universities or other post-secondary institutions. Thinking about what we're looking to do other than simply getting the numbers up, simply increasing representation. Depending on who you ask on our campuses at the University of Alberta, the answer is going to be different. Because we're not entirely unified. We're a very diverse community, lots of different opinions. For some of us, removing obvious barriers to access and participation is pretty clear and simple what we're meant to be doing. For others, this is more about righting historical wrongs or one way in which we can begin true reconciliation. Still others are seeking to strengthen the university by increasing the presence of Indigenous perspectives in our classrooms and in our curricula. And some of us are most hopeful about improving socioeconomic conditions and labor market outcomes for Indigenous youth. Of course, these things are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, each of them is possible, and each of them inspires great hope. I tend to try to think about this each time we get bogged down, and we do get bogged down, in the finer points of policy language, or when I feel like we've hit the proverbial wall on the way to getting an important change approved. Most of my colleagues at the university working in this area will agree that we've learned a great deal already, and that it's critical that we remain open to learning more through each discussion or policy change proposal. We also generally accept that our policies will never be finished, done, complete, moving on to something else. This is really going to be an iterative process of ongoing learning and change. As soon as we finish consultation and approval on one piece of important policy change, we circle back and we begin advancing another important aspect of the discussion. In fact, Danielle's came up around the same time we had just completed work on our last round of policy changes. Then the question became, do we slow down? Do we stop for a bit? Do we pause? Is that going to do more harm than good? And while we figure out what all of this means. The title for this symposium, In and Beyond the Law, really resonates for me when I think about admissions policy development. Of course, universities must comply with the law. We lead important discussions, like this one, about how the law is to be interpreted and how it might evolve. Universities, though, also enjoy substantial autonomy that goes far beyond what the law prescribes. We carry important responsibilities in making choices that we articulate through our policies, including our admissions policies. There's been a lot written since the Daniels decision came down last year about what exactly it means and whether anyone, most often our federal government, but also public institutions like universities, have been directed to make any particular change to things like admissions policies. The general consensus has been that the Daniels decision doesn't direct us to do anything in particular just yet. But the concern becomes then whether there is going to be real change or whether we're going to become complacent, discuss when we're actually going to take action and what that action might look like. Daniels has also caused people to ask whether, as I said, whether we should slow our pace of policy change while we figure this out, or whether in fact that would do more harm than good. The most exciting aspect for me is not what universities do when we're directed to do something, when we must comply, when some new rule or law is instituted. I'm much more interested in what universities can do when we're inspired to do something new and when we have the autonomy to lead societal change. This is where the discussions in which you have all engaged in over the last couple of days derive their real power, and I look forward to seeing what's next. Thank you.
Next up, we have Valerie Arnault-Pelletier. Valerie was in the College of Nursing for the past 16 years, and now for the last 7 years has been the Aboriginal coordinator in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. And I will welcome you up to speak. Thank you.
I'm actually going to read a speech that I did to the Senate of Canada on this particular issue quite a few years back. So we've been thinking about this in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan for quite a few years, examining it at how are we doing admissions of Aboriginal students into our college. And actually started looking at this back when I was in nursing, because we were seeing a number of students come through who really had no connection to who they were as Métis students, First Nations students, and to be quite honest, we actually didn't get any Inuit students, so I can't really speak to that. So this speech, I'm just going to read it out to you as I had presented it quite a few years ago, and why we're doing what we're doing in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm a band member of Beardy's and Okimaasis First Nation, and I must acknowledge my mother's community of Waterhen First Nation. I'm the Aboriginal coordinator with the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan, and I'm here today to present on the topic of Aboriginal identity, and particularly Métis identity and our admissions processes in the College of Medicine at the university. Currently, we have 10 equity seats that are in the College of Medicine at the university, designated specifically for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. These seats are sanctioned by the Human Rights Commission of Saskatchewan, but more importantly, in my mind, they're sanctioned by family, communities, and elders, and our people. The applicants for our equity seats must meet the same admission requirements as any other applicant to our college. The only difference is our equity pool competes within itself. We have a responsibility and an obligation to ensure that these seats are filled by applicants with verifiable proof of ancestry as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit individuals. To this date, we have not had applicants that I'm aware of who've self-identified as Inuit. Our First Nations applicants with treaty or status cards have not presented an issue in terms of accessing our equity seats in our college at this point in time. The applicant pool that we have encountered concerns with are self-identified Métis applicants. The College of Medicine, we have historically not placed any parameters on how we accept Métis applicants, nor have we placed any restrictions on what is acceptable proof in terms of Métis applicants. We have accepted cards from various locals, Métis nations across the country, letters, genealogy charts, and other Métis cards from across Canada. The past admissions cycles, we have flagged applicants that were very much questioned by our admissions director, our admissions coordinator, and our Aboriginal admissions program staff. The applicants to our college provided cards that were issued by organizations that could also issue membership cards or affiliate cards for anyone who wished to belong to their organization. Most notable to me was the language on one of the websites of one of these organizations that stated they could issue Aboriginal status cards, and members receiving those Aboriginal status cards were identified as being from a Métis tribe, using terminology like white painted feather, tribe, and that sort of thing. To this date, I've not been able to determine if this is an actual tribal group or an actual Métis community. It concerns me greatly that we potentially have individuals who are taking advantage of our equity seats for their own means. They've not indicated any intention of reciprocity or pay it forward to our people. When the files of these Métis applicants were flagged by our admissions team, we decided to take a closer look at the cards issued by organizations that were issued outside of the Métis National Council and its provincial counterparts and locals. The organizations identified each had the purview to issue affiliate membership cards, which, as far as I can determine, could be approved for anyone wishing to be an affiliate member of a Métis organization for a fee. These affiliate membership cards could be potentially used for purposes of entering post-secondary or other training or education institutions, accessing scholarships, bursaries, and tuition dollars designated for Métis students. Because we accept out-of-province Métis students in our college, this presents an issue when we have no way of verifying the background or genealogy. One of our applicants a few years ago indicated that the roots of the family tree had a great-grandmother from a tribal group in the northeastern United States, and the other parent was a health professional from another country. I am still unclear as to how this translates into the ability to obtain a Métis card. As part of our consultation process, we discussed this with Métis students, elders, the Aboriginal Student Centre, the U of S Registrar, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan reps, Métis National Council, the Human Rights Commission, the Education and Equity Consultant for our province, Student Enrollment Services, and even our U of S Legal Counsel. So we did a comprehensive review, and as a result of many meetings, many phone calls, emails, discussions, we ended up with a policy on our website currently that reads, applicants will be required to identify themselves on the application for admission to be eligible to compete within the Aboriginal Equity Program. Acceptable proofs of ancestry include status or treaty card, Métis membership card, Nunavut Trust Service card, or Inuit roll number. The College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan will only recognize Métis cards from the provincial counterparts of the Métis National Council. Genealogies may be requested, and the decisions of the admissions committee are final. Unfortunately, we had to go that route. Now, in light of the Danielle's decision, it's going to be interesting moving forward because we may want to revisit our policy at some point and decide that collectively that we need to, revisit our consultations and move things forward appropriately. So I think I'll leave it at that. There's a whole lot more to this letter, but that's basically what the crux of the issue was for us, certainly at our university and within our college. And it does concern me greatly that we have individuals, and this has happened more than once, and it's becoming increasingly a problem, where we have individuals coming who have absolutely no Aboriginal ancestry, and they're taking the seats away from our people. And that's not what they were intended to do. I know it's controversial. I know not everybody agrees, and that's okay. I think we have to have some criteria, some guidelines, and we have to have some way forward with this issue. Otherwise, we may as well not have equity seats, and I would hate to see that happen. Denegi, Nanaskaman.
Next up, we have Dr. André Costopoulos. André was the former Dean of Students at McGill University and is quite recently now the Dean of Students at the University of Alberta. Here. So welcome, André.
Thank you. So for me, from my perspective, admission to university is a matter primarily of equity. It's a matter of achieving true equity so that we can build true diversity in our communities. And I don't think we can argue that there is true equity in our society right now or in our universities. Equity means equality of opportunity, largely. I don't think there is that either. And that means that in some cases where there's clear historical injustice, for example, in cases where there is systemic inequality of opportunity, that means we have to be proactive. We have to make up for it. We have to find ways of giving advantages to those who have had historical disadvantages while we have to, basically, and we have to constantly decide who is it that needs help right now in terms of equity, and who is it that doesn't. And these are discussions that we constantly have to have. So we have to worry about equity on the one hand. We also have to balance that with a concern for the success of individuals and communities and society as a whole. We don't do anyone any favors if we bring to a place like U of A or McGill students who are not ready for it, who are not ready to be successful, to get the most out of it, and then to make a difference in their community and to make a difference in society in general. So we have to find ways of identifying potential students from situations where there's a lack of equity, but who are ready to take on the challenge of a university education in a place like U of A. Which brings me to my next topic, which is credentials. Right? Universities traditionally in the West use certain signals that students are ready for university. Right? High school diplomas and A-levels and French bac, et cetera, et cetera. People don't necessarily have access to these formal credentials. That doesn't mean they're not ready to be students at U of A. And on the other side, we can say, we know that also at least some of the students who come to us with those formal credentials, who've had an easier time getting them because they're in a position of privilege, are not ready to study at U of A. So we have to worry about that side also. So how do we recognize a variety of credentials? And what do we recognize as credentials? You know, I work in, I'm an archaeologist, full disclosure. I work in, I work with Cree communities in James Bay mainly, and I know some people there who are fantastic, could step into a place like McGill or U of A tomorrow morning, be very successful as students, they don't have the formal credentials. Why? Because they stayed in their community, they want to make a difference there. Someone who has run the youth program of a community for 5 years is capable of being a successful student at a place like U of A. We have to recognize that. Not only is it a matter of recognizing credentials for potential students, but also for hiring in terms of staff and faculty. We also have certain traditional signals in the West that we interpret as meaning someone is ready to be a professor. Think about the word professor, someone who has the right to profess. Right? How do we recognize who has the right to profess? Traditionally for us in the West, it's been the PhD. Right? That's not the only signal. That is not the only credential that tells us someone has something to say that young people need to hear. We need to worry about that as well. How do we recognize different kinds of credentials to know who should we bring in to teach in the university and to do research? And I think if we handle these right, if we find solutions gradually to build equity, to recognize a diversity of credentials, to worry about people's success, to make sure that they can make a positive difference for their communities, then we build true diversity. And we all benefit from true diversity, because we never know where the next problem is going to come from. We never know where the solution is going to be. We have to have as many tools in our toolbox as we can possibly have in order to face challenges all together. Thanks.
And finally, we have Kara Paul, originally from Eskasoni. Kara is the director of the Aboriginal Health Services Initiative at Dalhousie University. Welcome.
Just trying to find my presentation. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I would like to thank Chris for inviting me, and I'd like to really acknowledge Chantel's really great work and being so helpful this week and very accommodating. So thank you, Michelle. My presentation is about Dalhousie's affirmative action and self-identification policies. Dal's general approach to admissions is we respect. Jones' general approach is that we do not question a person's affiliation and do not ask for proof of ancestry. So it's a very wide open policy. However, there are some schools that do have some policies that are directed at targeted Mi'kmaq population. So the Nova Scotia's Freedom of Information and Protection Act, this seems to be constraining our ability to ask for confirmation or any type of proof of ancestry. Because it's only to be used by consent of students, so that's really constraining our ability to really build robust affirmative action policies. So the challenges with this is that self-identification is a voluntary process. And so anybody can self-identify Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Métis, Inuit, anybody. And however, so the implications of this is that the validity of self-identification for a competitive program such as medicine that my colleagues are talking about, and this is where the obvious contention is. So right now in medicine, our affirmative action policy is around trying to create equity for equity-seeking groups. So our focus is on the maritime Aboriginal population and the African Nova Scotian population. So, and that is, in the past, the Faculty of Medicine, because they didn't include Métis in the past. However, because there's no verification process, that really didn't matter. So the self-identification policy, what we did last year to try to increase some kind of vetting process, we implemented this policy here, as you see, because our target is the Atlantic maritime population. We looked at asking we asked our students who had self-identified as Aboriginal students, applicants, that to write a 250-page essay talking about their connection to Mi'kmaq. And we asked them to identify as Mi'kmaq Maliseet, who are the traditional holders of the Atlantic. And if you're Aboriginal Canadian, you can self-identify in those 3 categories. However, this policy is no longer being used. We used it only 1 year. The concern is that it's too narrowly focused and was causing concerns that we might be excluding applicants, which is not something we want to do. We want to move to inclusion. So that brings us to, the other concern about that, I know that a lot of our scholarships and bursary programs, we actually do ask for, community connection, and we ask for your, who you are and who your family is and all of these things. But for seats and admissions into these competitive programs, we do not do that. The concern about the narrow focus policy was that because the absence of a robust policy, that there is actually an increase of fraudulent application. We can't prove that, but it's something that we are very concerned about. So I mean, in Nova Scotia, as you know, our contact started in like the 1500s. So it's a long, long relationship of colonization. And as it is right now, our Mi'kmaq Grand Council does not acknowledge the Eastern Métis of my area. The approach is that, and the teachings are that when we actually had relationships and we had mix-in, families either became Métis or they became Acadian, right? So there was no need for a new society of Métis because there was no marginalization, there was an inclusion type approach to life. So that adds another level of contention with affirmative action policy, because right now we're on the front end actually trying to develop more policies, and that's coming down the pike. So actually, I'm really hoping that we'll get some feedback in what you think the approach should be, because in the East we are really looking for some guidance around Métis identity, right? So I mean, I don't need that slide. You all know that. So I went through that. So here are the questions. What should self-identification look like? What are the benefits and challenges? And what would she consider for criteria for affirmative action policies for seats and scholarship? So as Danielle and my colleagues talked about, we're trying to create equity for marginalized groups. And with the new, all of these new organizations are propping up with cards that anybody can get, it's further marginalizing the marginalized. So that's the question that we have, and we're looking for you for guidance. Thank you. Valerie.
Kara, you probably meant historically they either became Acadian or Mi'kmaq, not Métis.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Or Acadian.
And so what we're going to do now is we're just going to allow the panelists to talk amongst themselves just in terms of what they've heard from each other for a bit. If you have anything to say in terms of either common experiences or differences between different universities, and then we'll open it up to the floor for discussion. Or if you got nothing, we can just open it up to the floor. Okay, sure. We can just open it up to the floor then. So anyone who has questions, feel free to ask a question.
Good afternoon. Kim Bowden from Saskatchewan, Vice Chief of the Congress. I want to start off by saying that Danielle's was a conciliatory and inclusive decision. I believe that's what it was. And when I think about all these things that had come up, first guy that popped up in my head was Grail. Everybody knows, probably has history about Grail. And then recently, Joseph Boyden, and that's one for discussion. And it's, I work in the justice field quite a bit. I deal with the, I actually work with ex-gang members in Saskatoon who want to stay out of the gang life. And just ask a police officer about racial profiling, because they're good at it. They're status blind. They don't ask you if you have a Métis card or a status card or treaty card. They just say, you're under arrest. you have Indigenous people who go to stores, they profile you in there. I could go on and on. But the thing I was wondering about in some of the presentation is I notice with respect to CAP, we have to deal with this issue as well, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. And we have 10 affiliates or 10 provincial territorial organizations in this country, coast to coast. And in terms of Nova Scotia, for example, the Native Council of Nova Scotia, I was wondering if you had any discussions with them. That was one. And Ontario Coalition of Indigenous People, there's another one. They do have stringent criteria in terms of membership. So they look at all the boxes because we, again, like I was saying, we get the same thing. We don't want, I used to call them M&Ms, magically Métis. And this is years, I sort of coined that phrase a few years ago because all of a sudden now, and it's getting like that with the Daniels issues, this is what's going to happen. More people are going to come out more. And the question is, when do you cut it off, or do you cut it off? Because then you had other stimulating discussion earlier this morning about community and the connections and all that. And it was so interesting. So I believe it's the community that's going to have to decide that. But I'm extending an invite to you guys with respect to getting a hold of us, or the office at the Congress, and we certainly want to work with you on these policy issues, and make sure that everybody's treated fairly, and that we are I guess you can say, in step with the Daniels decision as well. So thank you for that, and it was a great presentation.
Hi, Paul Seaman. I'm a lawyer at Gowlings, and I was on a panel previously in this conference on the Daniels case. I was actually acted for an intervener at the Daniels case, and I get asked questions like this quite often. And my question, it's partly a comment and partly a question. It's in part directed to Valerie. I'm from Saskatchewan. My oldest sister went to the Faculty of Medicine. And I was just curious, how was the decision arrived at to just rely on MNC cards? So just by way of background, it seems to me anyways that that's missing a few important people, and a good example I think would be the Métis settlements, who their membership is recognized by statute. There's the NWT Métis, CAP, and of course Pally tells us that really the heart of it is having an objectively verifiable membership system in place. And just not to turn this into a legal case or a cross-examination, but in the Pally case, the whole idea of what degree of ancestry was needed was not really a live issue. And in the court below, in the Ontario Court of Appeal, it was actually commented to that effect, where it said, we don't really have to address this issue because the Pallies meet the highest and most demanding test. So anyways, I was just curious how your decision, or how the university's decision, not your decision, but how the university arrived at that decision.
Well, it wasn't actually a university decision. It's a College of Medicine policy. So it's not, I guess, legally binding. It probably could be challenged. We did our due diligence in terms of consulting, not only with past medical students, Aboriginal students, but certainly with elders, families, communities, and many, many other stakeholders. As I said, it's not something that we wouldn't revisit. The policy would not be something that we're going to set in stone, and we certainly haven't. We certainly have looked at people who've come forward with other acceptable proofs of ancestry. We had a non-status fellow who came forward. He didn't have any kind of card from his First Nations community or from a Métis community. So we took a look at what he had, we spoke to his family, and we made a decision that we would accept his application. So I don't think we're in by any way, shape, or form meaning to be exclusionary. We certainly want to be inclusionary, but we do have to have some criteria, some guidelines. So our guideline is not set in stone.
Okay, no, I quite agree
I'll
with that.
leave it at that. And certainly we do consult, and we are open to consulting with other groups and other provinces, but doing the best we can, hoping that it's actually the organizations out there that are deciding who the membership is. And we shouldn't have to be deciding at the university level or making those decisions, nor are we comfortable doing that.
Thank you.
If I could just comment for the University of Alberta, because we've also struggled with this issue. If you were to look in our academic calendar right now about what forms of proof of identity are acceptable, we have very general language about a Métis card. And we have had concerns expressed within our academic community about cards in the mail, cards for a fee, this sort of thing. So the question has become, what do we do about that? And so our proposed policy change lists specifically exactly which Métis cards we will accept, the 4 provincial affiliate organizations, et cetera. But then, of course, is that too narrow becomes the question. And who are we excluding when we do that? So there are 2 offsetting mechanisms that we hope will help in the proposal. One is a very important line at the end of the list of proof. Other proof of identity may be considered. Which allows us to continue, that is in our current policy, but we felt it important to continue to be able to consider cases like the one my colleague mentioned. And then we also have an appeal mechanism, and that appeal board has on it both an elder and a student representative, as well as some other university representatives, to make sure that if we get it wrong, that there's a check and balance or at least a second look at that decision. We would hope that the kinds of students that we hope to come forward with honorable intentions don't have to go to an appeal process to be admitted to the university on our calendar, so that, but under our policy, but that would be, we feel it's important to maintain that mechanism as a check and as an important check and balance on what it is that we're doing.
Other questions?
Do you have questions?
No, I'm full of questions, but full of something anyway. Yeah. That's interesting. No other questions. That's got to be a first in a Métis conference. Well, maybe we can wrap it up early and take a break, and we can start the next session early as well. So everybody, join me in thanking our panelists for coming.